They heard it at 2300 hours on the night of October 24, 1944. A brief radio transmission, lasting perhaps 4 seconds, crackling through the headsets of 18 destroyer commanders spread across the dark waters of Surigao Strait. The message was simple, technical, almost mundane in its delivery. But in those 4 seconds, every captain who heard it understood that the perfect ambush they were sailing into had just been exposed. The destroyers were American, part of Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's screening force positioned at the northern end of Surigao Strait in the Philippines. They were moving south in the darkness, preparing to execute a torpedo attack against Japanese battleships advancing up the strait. The plan was textbook destroyer doctrine. Approach at high speed under cover of darkness, launch torpedoes at close range, then reverse course and escape before the enemy could respond with their heavy guns. It was aggressive, dangerous, and exactly what destroyer crews trained for. The radio burst came from a destroyer further south, closer to the approaching Japanese force. The transmission reported contact. Radar contact. Multiple large ships, bearing and range specified with precision. The information was technical, stripped of emotion or commentary. But every commander who heard it knew immediately what it meant. The Japanese knew they were coming. The element of surprise, the single advantage that made destroyer torpedo attacks survivable, was gone. And yet the attack continued. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What followed in the next 90 minutes would become one of the most studied destroyer actions of the Pacific War, not because it was particularly heroic or dramatic, but because it revealed something fundamental about how the United States Navy had learned to wage war by late 1944. The lesson was not about courage or training or even technology, though all of those played their roles. The lesson was about how American forces had developed systems, doctrine, and equipment that could turn even a compromised attack into a devastating success. The 4-second radio burst was part of that system. Understanding why it mattered requires understanding what destroyer warfare had become by the fall of 1944, and how different that was from what anyone had expected when the war began. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was already 3 days old when those destroyers entered Surigao Strait. American forces under General Douglas MacArthur had landed on Leyte Island in the central Philippines on October 20. The invasion was the first step in liberating the Philippines and cutting off Japan's access to oil and resources from Southeast Asia. The Japanese Navy responded with everything it had left, committing virtually its entire remaining surface fleet to a complex multi-pronged counterattack designed to destroy the American landing force. The Japanese plan, designated Shogo or Victory Operation, called for 3 separate forces to converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would bring the strongest force, including the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, through San Bernardino Strait north of Leyte. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would bring a southern force of 2 battleships and supporting vessels through Surigao Strait. And Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would bring Japan's remaining aircraft carriers south from Japanese waters to act as a decoy, drawing off the American carrier force and leaving the landing beaches vulnerable. By the night of October 24, the plan was already falling apart. American submarines had detected and reported all 3 Japanese forces. American carrier aircraft had attacked Kurita's center force repeatedly, sinking Musashi and damaging other ships. But Nishimura's southern force was still intact and still advancing towards Surigao Strait, apparently unaware that the Americans knew exactly where they were and had prepared a reception that would utilize every advantage of position, technology, and doctrine that 3 years of Pacific warfare had developed. The destroyers moving south that night were part of that reception. They belonged to Destroyer Squadron 54, commanded by Captain Jesse Coward, though the attack would actually be led by Commander Richard H. Phillips aboard USS Remy. These were Fletcher-class destroyers, the backbone of the American destroyer force in the Pacific. They were modern ships, completed in 1942 and 1943, equipped with the latest radar and fire control systems. Each carried 5 single 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, and depth charge racks. They displaced 2,100 tons fully loaded and could make 37 knots at flank speed. More importantly, they were part of a tactical system that had been refined through dozens of night actions across the Pacific over the previous 3 years. American destroyer doctrine in 1944 bore little resemblance to the doctrine of 1941. The early years of the war had been brutal teachers. American destroyers had fought Japanese destroyers in the confined waters around Guadalcanal and learned hard lessons about Japanese night fighting superiority. Japanese destroyers had better torpedoes, better night optics, and crews trained specifically for night surface combat. American destroyers in 1942 often didn't know they were under attack until Japanese torpedoes were already in the water. But by 1944, everything had changed. American destroyers now had radar that could detect enemy ships at ranges where visual identification was impossible. They had radio communications that allowed coordinated attacks by multiple ships. They had fire control computers that could calculate firing solutions faster and more accurately than any human. And they had doctrine that emphasized using these technological advantages to overwhelm opponents before they could respond. The radar was key. American destroyers by late 1944 carried multiple radar sets. The SG Surface Search Radar, operating at 3,000 MHz, could detect large ships at ranges exceeding 20 miles in good conditions. The Mark IV Fire Control Radar could track targets and provide continuous range and bearing data to the ship's gun directors. These systems gave American ships what amounted to night vision in an era when most naval combat still relied on visual sighting through optical rangefinders. The radio systems were equally important, though less celebrated. American destroyers carried TBS equipment, talk between ships radio sets that operated on very high frequency bands around 60 MHz. These radios had limited range, usually less than 25 miles, but within that range they provided clear voice communication between ships. More importantly, TBS transmissions were difficult for the Japanese to intercept or jam. The Japanese Navy in 1944 still relied primarily on signal lamps and flag signals for tactical communication between ships, methods that required visual contact and were easily disrupted by smoke, weather, or darkness. The combination of radar and radio created a capability that would have seemed almost magical to naval officers of an earlier generation. American destroyers could detect enemy ships beyond visual range, communicate that information instantly to other friendly ships, coordinate their movements and attacks without ever being seen, and deliver accurate gunfire or torpedo attacks guided by radar rather than human eyesight. It was a complete transformation of naval warfare, driven by technology but implemented through carefully developed doctrine and intensive training. The torpedo doctrine that Captain Phillips would employ that night reflected this transformation. American destroyer torpedo attacks in the early war had been desperate, close-range affairs. Destroyers would charge to within a few thousand yards of their targets, launch their torpedoes, and attempt to escape in the confusion. Casualties were heavy. Accuracy was poor. The Japanese Long Lance torpedo, with its range of 40,000 yards and massive warhead, consistently outperformed American weapons in these encounters. By 1944, American tactics had evolved. Destroyers would use their radar to detect targets at long range, maneuver into favorable attack positions while still beyond enemy visual range, launch torpedoes at distances of 10 to 15,000 yards, and then withdraw before the enemy could respond. The Mark 15 torpedo carried by American destroyers had been improved since the early war years when unreliable magnetic exploders and depth-keeping problems made it nearly useless. By late 1944, with contact exploders and better depth control, the Mark 15 was a reliable weapon with a range of 6,000 yards at 45 knots or 15,000 yards at 26 knots. The doctrine emphasized coordination. Multiple destroyers would attack simultaneously from different bearings, saturating the target area with torpedoes and dividing the enemy's defensive fire. Radio communication allowed the attack to be coordinated in real time, with destroyers adjusting their approach based on radar reports from other ships. It was systematic, almost mechanical in its precision. And it required constant communication between ships to execute properly. That communication requirement was why the 4-second radio burst mattered so much. In earlier naval warfare, once ships lost visual contact with each other, coordination became nearly impossible. Signal lamps were useless beyond a few miles. Flag signals couldn't be seen in darkness. Individual ships were forced to act independently, following prearranged plans but unable to adapt to changing circumstances. The TBS radio changed that fundamentally. As long as ships remained within radio range, they could coordinate their actions continuously, sharing information about enemy movements, their own positions, and tactical intentions. The destroyers that received that 4-second transmission were executing a plan that had been developed with extraordinary precision. Rear Admiral Oldendorf had positioned his entire force to create what naval tacticians call a crossing of the T, a formation where the entire broadside of one fleet can fire on the leading ships of an enemy column while the enemy can only return fire with their forward guns. At the northern end of Surigao Strait, Oldendorf had positioned 6 battleships in a line across the strait. 5 of them were survivors of Pearl Harbor, raised from the mud and rebuilt for this moment. Below them, cruisers were positioned on both flanks. And screening the entire force, moving south to meet the advancing Japanese, were the destroyers. The destroyer attack plan called for 3 separate squadrons to attack in sequence. Destroyer Squadron 54 would attack first from the west side of the strait. Then Destroyer Squadron 24 would attack from the east. Finally, a third group would make a follow-up attack if needed. Each squadron would approach to within 10,000 yards, launch their torpedoes, and withdraw at high speed. The entire operation would be coordinated by radio, with each ship reporting its position, course, and the moment of torpedo launch so that other ships could avoid firing on friendly vessels or wasting torpedoes on already doomed targets. Commander Phillips aboard Remy led the 1st Squadron south at 22:50 hours. With him were USS McGowan, USS Melvin, USS McDermott, and USS Monson. They were in column formation, moving at 25 knots, their SG radars sweeping the darkness ahead. At 2300 hours, Remy's radar detected the Japanese force at a range of 38,000 yards, approximately 19 nautical miles. The contact was solid, multiple large ships in column formation, advancing up the strait at approximately 15 knots. Phillips immediately transmitted the contact report. For seconds on the TBS radio. Range, bearing, enemy course, and speed. Every destroyer commander in the strait heard it. Every battleship and cruiser commander heard it. Admiral Oldendorf heard it. And critically, every other destroyer preparing to attack heard it. They now knew exactly where the enemy was, what course they were following, and how fast they were moving. More importantly, they knew that the Japanese were continuing their advance, apparently unaware that American forces were waiting. The Japanese force consisted of 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers. The battleships were Yamashiro and Fuso, both completed in the 1910s and modernized in the 1930s. They displaced over 30,000 tons each and carried 12 14-inch guns and 6 twin turrets. These were formidable warships by any standard, capable of destroying any destroyer with a single salvo if they could bring their guns to bear. The heavy cruiser Mogami carried 10 8-inch guns. The destroyers were newer ships, carrying the Type 93 torpedo, the Long Lance, widely regarded as the best torpedo of the war. Vice Admiral Nishimura, commanding the force, knew he was advancing into restricted waters where ambush was possible. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive action and night combat, areas where Japanese training and equipment had proven superior in the early war years. Nishimura's ships were equipped with excellent optical rangefinders and his crews were trained for night action. But his ships lacked radar. They were advancing up a narrow strait, their formation constrained by the geography, relying on visual observation to detect threats. In the darkness, against ships equipped with radar and radio, they were effectively blind. Phillips continued his approach. At 23:20 hours, he turned his squadron westward, parallel to the Japanese course but offset to put his ships on the enemy's port side. This maneuver would allow him to launch torpedoes and then turn away without crossing in front of the enemy column where his ships would be silhouetted against the lighter western horizon. It was a textbook approach, practiced in countless exercises, refined through real combat experience. The squadron maintained radio silence now, following Phillips's lead, their radar tracking the Japanese force as the range closed. At 23:40 hours, range was down to 12,000 yards. Phillips ordered his ships to turn south, toward the enemy, preparing for the final approach and torpedo launch. Each destroyer carried 10 Mark 15 torpedoes and 2 quintuple centerline mounts. 50 torpedoes total for the squadron. The fire control teams on each ship were calculating firing solutions based on continuous radar data. Target range, target course, target speed, own ship course and speed, torpedo run time. The Mark 15 set to run at 45 knots had a range of 6,000 yards. Phillips planned to launch at approximately 9,000 yards, giving his torpedoes enough range while keeping his ships outside the effective range of Japanese searchlights. The torpedo officers on each destroyer made their final calculations. The Mark 15 was 24 feet long, 21 inches in diameter, and carried a warhead containing 825 pounds of Torpex explosive. It ran on a wet heater engine burning alcohol and compressed air, producing no visible wake. The depth setting was typically 12 to 15 feet, deep enough to run under small vessels but shallow enough to hit the submerged hull of a battleship or cruiser. Each torpedo cost approximately $10,000 to manufacture, a trivial sum compared to the value of the targets they were designed to destroy. At 23:54 hours, range 9,200 yards, Phillips gave the order. Remy launched all 10 torpedoes in rapid succession, the fish dropping from their tubes and entering the water with barely a splash, their propellers beginning to spin as the engines ignited and drove them toward the enemy column. McGowan launched. Melvin launched. McDermott launched. Monson launched. 50 torpedoes in the water, spreading out in a fan pattern calculated to cover the enemy formation. Launch time was transmitted on TBS. 4 seconds. Every ship knew the torpedoes were running. Phillips ordered his squadron to reverse course. The destroyers turned hard to starboard, coming around to the north at flank speed, putting distance between themselves and the enemy. This was the critical moment. The torpedoes would take approximately 5 minutes to reach their targets, running at 45 knots across 9,000 yards of water. If the Japanese detected them, if Japanese destroyers launched their own torpedoes in response, if Japanese battleship guns found the range, the American destroyers could be caught in a deadly crossfire. But the darkness and the lack of Japanese radar provided cover. The American ships accelerated north, their wakes churning white in the darkness, escaping the area before the Japanese could respond. At 23:59 hours, the first torpedoes reached their targets. Observers on the American destroyers, watching from miles away now, saw the flashes. Multiple explosions, bright orange bursts of flame visible even at this distance. The battleship Fuso was hit by multiple torpedoes almost simultaneously. The explosions tore open her hull below the waterline, flooding her machinery spaces and causing her to slow dramatically. Within minutes, she was dead in the water, her crew struggling to contain the flooding as she began to list. More explosions followed. Destroyers in the Japanese formation were hit. The precise number of torpedo hits would never be determined with certainty. Post-war analysis suggested at least 7 torpedoes found targets out of the 50 launched, a hit rate of 14%. In peacetime exercises, destroyer squadrons typically achieved hit rates below 5%. The difference was radar fire control, allowing accurate calculation of enemy course and speed, and the element of surprise maintained by launching beyond visual range. The 2nd Destroyer Squadron, Destroyer Squadron 24 under Captain K. M. McMahons, was already approaching from the eastern side of the strait. They had heard Phillips's contact report at 2300 hours. They had heard his launch report at 23:54. They knew exactly where the enemy was and that the Japanese formation was already damaged. McMahon's led his ships, USS Hutchins, USS Daly, USS Back, USS Beale, USS Killen, USS Benyon, and USS Haywood L. Edwards, into position on the eastern side of the Japanese column. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At 0006 hours on October 25, McMahon's squadron launched their torpedoes. 47 more torpedoes entered the water, approaching the Japanese formation from the opposite side. The Japanese were now bracketed, torpedoes coming from both east and west, their formation already disrupted by the first attack, their flagship Yamashiro trying to maintain course while Fuso fell behind, burning and listing. The Japanese responded as their doctrine dictated. They turned their searchlights on, brilliant white beams sweeping the darkness, looking for targets. They opened fire with their main batteries, 14-inch guns hurling massive shells towards suspected enemy positions. But they were firing blind, guided only by the brief glimpses of American ships illuminated by their own gun flashes. The American destroyers were already withdrawing, moving at flank speed, using smoke to cover their retreat. Japanese shells created enormous splashes in the water but scored no hits. More torpedo explosions rippled through the Japanese formation. Yamashiro was hit, at least once and possibly twice. The heavy cruiser Mogami was hit and began to fall out of formation. Japanese destroyers, attempting to screen the larger ships, were hit and began to sink. The carefully organized Japanese column was dissolving into chaos, individual ships maneuvering independently, some trying to continue north toward their objective, others turning to assist damaged vessels, all of them searching desperately for an enemy they could not see. Admiral Oldendorf, observing from his flagship Louisville at the northern end of the strait, had reports from both destroyer squadrons. He knew the Japanese formation was disrupted and damaged. He knew they were continuing their advance, though more slowly now. And he knew they were about to come within range of his battleships and cruisers, all of which were positioned perfectly to execute the crossing of the T that would complete the destruction of Nishimura's force. The battleships opened fire at 0019 hours. 6 battleships, firing in carefully controlled salvos, their guns aimed by radar fire control systems that could track targets in complete darkness. West Virginia fired first, her Mark 8 radar providing continuous range and bearing to the Japanese ships. She fired at a range of 22,800 yards, nearly 13 miles, a distance where optical fire control would have been impossible in the darkness. Her shells took approximately 30 seconds to reach their targets, massive projectiles arcing through the night sky and plunging down onto the Japanese ships. The bombardment lasted 18 minutes. In that time, the 6 American battleships fired 285 rounds of 16-inch and 14-inch ammunition. The cruisers fired an additional 4,000 rounds of 6-inch and 8-inch shells. The Japanese battleship Yamashiro, already damaged by torpedo hits, was struck repeatedly by heavy shells that penetrated her armor and exploded inside her hull. Fires spread throughout the ship. Her steering failed. Her main battery turrets were knocked out one by one. At 0019 hours, she capsized and sank, taking Vice Admiral Nishimura and most of her crew with her. Over 1,400 men died with the ship. The battleship Fuso, crippled by the first torpedo attack, never made it within range of the American battle line. She had been hit by at least 3 torpedoes and was already sinking when the bombardment began. She broke in 2 sections, both of which remained afloat for some time before finally going under. Survivors in the water reported that the 2 halves of the ship, separated by several hundred yards, both continued to burn for over an hour before disappearing. Over 1,600 men were lost with Fuso. The heavy cruiser Mogami, damaged by torpedoes and hammered by cruiser fire, turned south and attempted to escape the strait. She was intercepted the following morning by American cruisers and aircraft. Already badly damaged, unable to fight effectively, she was scuttled by her own crew after they were taken off by Japanese destroyers. Of the 4 Japanese destroyers that had accompanied the battleships into the strait, 3 were sunk during the night action. Only one escaped. The Battle of Surigao Strait was over by 0030 hours on October 25. The entire Japanese Southern Force had been destroyed in approximately 90 minutes of combat. American losses were minimal. One destroyer was damaged by a Japanese shell. No American ships were sunk. It was the most one-sided naval engagement of the Pacific War, and it would be the last time battleships would engage each other in combat in any war. The 4-second radio transmission that had warned the destroyers at 2300 hours the previous night was never recorded verbatim. No transcript exists in official records. The transmission was routine tactical communication, reporting contact information that was immediately superseded by subsequent reports as the action developed. But that single brief message had enabled everything that followed. It had allowed Commander Phillips to coordinate his approach with perfect knowledge of enemy position. It had allowed Captain McMahon to position his squadron for a second attack without confusion or delay. It had allowed Admiral Oldendorf to prepare his battle line with exact information about enemy course and speed. The contrast with Japanese capabilities was absolute. Vice Admiral Nishimura had no radar. His ships communicated with signal lamps and occasionally by flag signals during daylight. He had no way to detect American ships beyond visual range. He had no way to coordinate his movements with the other Japanese forces that were supposed to be converging on Leyte Gulf. When Admiral Kurita's center force turned away from San Bernardino Strait earlier that same day, Nishimura had no way of knowing. He advanced into Surigao Strait alone, believing he was part of a coordinated attack, unaware that the entire Japanese plan had already collapsed. The radar and radio systems that gave American forces such overwhelming advantage were not secret weapons or unexpected technological breakthroughs. They were the product of systematic industrial development and deployment that began years before the war. The United States had invested heavily in radio technology through the 1920s and 1930s. Commercial radio broadcasting had driven innovation in transmitter and receiver design. Companies like RCA had developed manufacturing capacity that could be rapidly scaled up for military production. When war came, American industry could produce radio equipment in quantities that would have seemed impossible to pre-war planners. The TBS radio equipment installed on American destroyers was manufactured by several companies including RCA, Radio Marine Corporation, and General Electric. Production ramped up rapidly after 1942. By 1944, virtually every American warship larger than a patrol boat had TBS capability. The radios were reliable, relatively simple to operate, and could be repaired or replaced quickly. Spare parts were abundant. Training for radio operators was standardized and thorough. The entire system, from design through manufacturing to deployment and maintenance, reflected the industrial capacity that made American naval dominance possible. Radar development followed a similar trajectory. The United States had begun serious radar development in the late 1930s, building on British research and adding American engineering and manufacturing capability. By 1941, American ships were being equipped with radar sets that could detect surface targets in aircraft. By 1943, radar fire control systems allowed accurate gunnery in conditions where optical rangefinders were useless. By 1944, radar and radio together had created a tactical advantage so overwhelming that night combat, traditionally a situation where training and experience mattered most, had become almost mechanical in its execution. The Japanese Navy knew about radar. Japanese engineers understood the principles and had developed their own radar systems. But Japan lacked the industrial capacity to produce radar equipment in quantity. Japanese radar sets were often unreliable, requiring constant maintenance that Japanese ships could not provide. Spare parts were scarce. Training was inconsistent. And critically, Japanese naval doctrine had not adapted to incorporate radar into tactical planning. Japanese admirals still planned and fought as though combat would be decided by optical gunnery and torpedo attacks executed by highly trained crews. They were fighting the war they had prepared for in the 1930s, while their opponents had already moved into a different era of warfare. The destroyer crews who had attacked in Surigao Strait understood this, though they might not have articulated it in exactly those terms. They knew their radar could see targets the Japanese could not detect. They knew their radios allowed coordination that Japanese forces could not match. They knew their torpedoes, while not as sophisticated as the Japanese long lance, were reliable weapons that could be employed with precision when guided by radar fire control. And they knew that these advantages were not the result of individual heroism or exceptional training, but rather the systematic application of industrial and technological superiority. Commander Phillips, writing his action report aboard Remy in the days after the battle, noted that his squadron had executed the torpedo attack exactly as planned, approaching to the predetermined range, launching at the calculated moment, and withdrawing without taking damage. The attack had succeeded because every ship had accurate information about enemy position and movement, because coordination between ships was instantaneous and reliable, and because the enemy had no effective way to detect or respond to the attack until torpedoes were already in the water. Phillips did not claim any particular brilliance in tactics or exceptional courage under fire. He described a well-executed operation that proceeded according to doctrine, enabled by equipment that worked as designed. Admiral Oldendorf, in his report to Admiral Kincaid, commanding 7th Fleet, was more expansive in his analysis. He noted that the destruction of the Japanese Southern Force demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated operations using all available weapons systems. The destroyer torpedo attacks had crippled the enemy formation before it came within gun range. The battleship and cruiser bombardment had then completed the destruction with minimal risk to American forces. The entire action had been made possible by radar detection and radio communication that gave American forces complete situational awareness while the enemy remained effectively blind. But perhaps the most telling assessment came from a junior officer aboard one of the destroyers, writing in a personal letter home several weeks after the battle. He described the night action in Surigao Strait as less like a battle and more like an industrial process. The destroyers had approached, launched their torpedoes, and withdrawn with mechanical precision. The battleships had fired their guns at targets they never saw with human eyes, guided by radar and fire control computers. The Japanese ships had burned and sunk, and throughout the entire action, none of the American participants felt they were in serious danger. The outcome had never been in doubt, not because American sailors were braver or more skilled, but because American ships had capabilities the Japanese simply could not match. This was the reality of naval warfare by late 1944. Technology had become more important than training. Industrial capacity mattered more than fighting spirit. A 4-second radio transmission warning of enemy position was worth more than hours of navigation and seamanship, because it enabled coordination and concentration of force that older methods of communication could not provide. The Japanese Navy, which had begun the war with highly trained crews and excellent equipment, had been unable to keep pace with the technological and industrial transformation of naval combat. By Surigao Strait, Japanese ships were still fighting as though World War II was being conducted according to World War I principles, while their opponents had already entered a new era. The Battle of Leyte Gulf continued for 2 more days after Surigao Strait. Admiral Kurita's center force, which had reversed course and retreated from San Bernardino Strait, turned around again and managed to surprise the American escort carriers off Samar on October 25. In the resulting battle, Kurita's battleships and cruisers inflicted serious losses on the American force before withdrawing, having missed the opportunity to attack the invasion beaches. Admiral Ozawa's carrier force successfully lured Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet north, but was then destroyed by American carrier aircraft in the battle off Cape Engano. By October 27, the Japanese Navy had lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. It would never again be able to challenge American naval supremacy. The destroyers that had fought in Surigao Strait continued their war. Remy, McGowan, Melvin, McDermott, and Monson all survived the war and returned to the United States for decommissioning. Some were later reactivated for the Korean War. Most were eventually scrapped in the 1960s and 1970s. Their combat records were typical of Fletcher-class destroyers, ships that served throughout the Pacific Campaign, participated in dozens of actions, and formed the backbone of American naval power in the theater. The TBS radio equipment that had enabled their coordination in Surigao Strait remained standard equipment on American warships for decades. The basic technology, very high-frequency voice radio operating in the 60 to 80 MHz range, proved so effective that it was retained long after the war ended. Modern navies still use similar systems, though with much improved range and clarity. The principle remains the same: instant voice communication between ships allows coordination and concentration of force that would be impossible with older methods. The radar systems that had allowed American ships to detect and track the Japanese force in complete darkness continued to improve throughout the war and after. By 1945, American ships carried radar systems that could detect periscopes and even individual swimmers in the water. The post-war development of radar continued at a rapid pace, driven by Cold War competition and the constant need for better detection and tracking of aircraft and missiles. Modern naval radar can track hundreds of targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 100 miles, but the fundamental principle established by 1944 remains unchanged: radar gives the ship that has it an enormous advantage over opponents who lack it. The 4-second radio transmission that began this story was remarkable not because it was heroic or dramatic, but because it was routine. It was a standard contact report, transmitted according to established procedure, received by ships whose crews had trained extensively in using such information. The transmission itself contained no brilliant insights, no unexpected information, no dramatic revelations. It simply confirmed what American forces already suspected, that Japanese ships were advancing up Surigao Strait toward the waiting ambush. But that simple confirmation, delivered instantly to every ship in the area, enabled a level of coordination and tactical execution that would have been impossible in any previous era of naval warfare. The Japanese force advancing up that strait was doomed not by any particular tactical mistake or failure of courage, but by the simple fact that they were fighting with capabilities appropriate to an earlier era against opponents who had already moved beyond that era. Vice Admiral Nishimura was an experienced officer who had served in the Japanese Navy for over 30 years. His crews were well trained by the standards of any navy. His ships were powerful warships that would have been formidable opponents in any previous conflict. But in October 1944, against American forces equipped with radar and radio and backed by industrial capacity that could produce equipment in quantities Japan could not match, Nishimura's force never had a chance. The battle demonstrated what the Pacific War had become by its final year. It was no longer a contest between roughly equivalent forces where training and tactics could decide outcomes. It had become a demonstration of industrial and technological superiority so overwhelming that individual battles were almost foreordained in their results. American forces could see in the darkness, communicate instantly across miles of ocean, coordinate complex operations with precision, and bring overwhelming firepower to bear on targets that never saw them coming. Japanese forces, fighting without these capabilities, were reduced to hoping for tactical surprise or individual heroism to overcome systemic disadvantages. At Surigao Strait, even those hopes proved futile. The story of that 4-second radio transmission is the story of how warfare had changed, not through any single dramatic innovation but through the systematic application of technology and industrial capacity to tactical problems. The transmission itself was unremarkable. What made it significant was that it was possible at all, that American destroyers could communicate instantly and reliably in the middle of a night battle, sharing information that allowed them to coordinate attacks with the precision of peacetime exercises. That capability, multiplied across hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft, made American victory in the Pacific not just likely but inevitable. The Japanese Navy at Surigao Strait learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible, destroyed by enemies they never saw, defeated by technology they could not match, in a battle that demonstrated more clearly than any other that the age of radar and radio had made previous methods of naval warfare obsolete. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.